Right, guys, thanks very much. Yeah, I almost want to pick up and where Prof. Lawrence has dropped off here and start by saying, yeah, we can learn a lot from the farmers. I'm going to go as far as to say the role of the vet in optimal dairy nutrition is to a certain extent to learn from the farmers. And I think my next slide will typically explain why. Just if we take a little bit of a step back here, Corley, I don't know you or Leon, do we know roughly how many vet students sitting in? Is half the audience vet students and the other half farmers, roughly?
It's about 70 is vet students, and the rest will be dairy consultants or farmers from the industry.
Okay, many thanks. So obviously I have the presentation mainly directed at the vet students, and so that will be the main party line. But seeing that we do have a whole bunch of farmers, and year after year farmers are commenting on the presentation, so I've changed my focus a little bit. So I'm going to try and incorporate the farmers just to a certain extent here. I think the point of this lecture is just the role of a vet in sort of dairy nutrition, or applied in optimal dairy nutrition. The vet will always have a little bit of a different perspective. If you consider a farmer, and this for the vet students, the farmers, we often joke with our farming clients because you spend a lot of time with them and you develop a bit of a relationship with most of these guys. They wear a lot of hats. They're not just farmers. And this is not a list intended to be read through, but I mean, they really are economists, and they have to consider what's happening on a macroeconomic level. I mean, we've got fertilizers issues happening all across the globe. We've got the whole climate change story. We've got, what's going to happen? Do they want to invest in South Africa? Do they want to buy a farm in, I don't know, Tasmania rather? But where's the safest investment for them? So there's a lot of considerations from an economy point of view, and the microeconomics in the country even are still, maize prices, and what's going to happen with, well, it's political situations even, and what's going to happen with the land and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of balls that the farmer needs to carry just from an economy point of view. Same with the climate. What's going to happen? We're in the Tsitsikamma area, and are we still going to have rain in the next 10 or 20 years? These are things that the farmers do worry about and consider. Obviously, there's pasture scientists and they're mechanics. For tractor brake, it's one thing to fix that, but it's a whole different story to fix a pump. And then the next thing, it's a milking machine. And these farmers really do know a lot about each and every aspect of these things. And they use terminology with pumps and with whatever that I haven't heard of, and I've been in the industry for quite a long time. Same with electrician, and I'm not going to read this list. I think the concept speaks for itself. I mean, the farmers, in the next day, they need to, well, next moment to moment, they need to jump into HR manager and then employer, and then they need to go fix a road somewhere. And meanwhile, they're trying to grow really good pastures, and so they're an agronomist and just everything. So the farmer, they've really got a wide focus, and I often, it's one of the things that gets me about a farmer is you will typically have a conversation like this, looking them in the eye, and the next moment, whilst they're looking at you, they'll start to shout at someone way off in the field for doing something wrong. And so they've just always got this, all the tentacles out all over the show, and so they're a very special kind of breed. It's not the idyllic, if you want to be a farmer, you just got a little cow that walks around in the mountain and you make money. It's just not the way things are, especially in dairy. And I think that we'll all have a bit of an appreciation for it. But even amongst vets, you consider the small animal guys versus the large animal dogs. I have a small animal practice as well, but I can tell you there's just as much, if not more, technical aspects in dairy as opposed to what you have in small animals. It's not easier work. It's not more simplistic. A dairy farmer that hat should read the world's greatest profession, really. And they start working at night. They really are a special breed of people. And so I think to finish off Prof. Lawrence's point, we should really learn a lot from them. We don't necessarily have to learn how to fix pumps, although I've actually done that from a farmer. pointing, there's a lot we can learn from them. And so our perspective will always differ quite a bit. So this is just a little bit of background about myself, my limitations. I'm not a specialist. I'm just a normal dairy vet. And we mostly serve pasture side clients. We're in the Tsitsikamma area and we do not have a single TMR. We do have some partial TMRs, but they come and go with season. And so that will be the extent of my TMR knowledge. So I'm going to obviously be skewed toward the pasture setup. Currently 4 dairy vets. We do some smallies and we service about 45,000 cows in the Tsitsikamma to Gamtoos area. It sounds like a lot of focus has been on pasture, where in the past most of this type of focus has been on TMRs, just because it's probably closer to Onderstepoort. But just as a bit of a background here, some of the major differences that I see between pastures and TMRs, and those are really 2 different breeds of cows, really, if you ask me. Obviously, we have the main thing that we have to deal with is the seasonal changes in grass quality. And when there's abundant grass, we need to produce abundant milk, and that messes up the whole country's milk supply. I mean, more than a third of the country's milk comes from the Eastern Cape, and most of which would be pasture-based, and that messes around quite a lot of things for the milk processors and obviously the national supply. Same issue with New Zealand, which produces a lot of milk, and the seasonality tend to affect international markets even. So we're obviously very seasonal bound. That means whereas a TMR can have an intercalving period of 400 days, and they aim for roughly that, if it doesn't fit into 365 days in the seasonal farm, she's out. She doesn't fit into the season. She needs to calve every year. If she doesn't, then she may move on 6 months to another group, or oftentimes she just exits the herd. And so intercalving period would necessarily be very strictly bound within 365 days. The breeding period, we typically have a 12-week breeding period. Obviously, it sometimes gets extended, sometimes gets shortened. Sometimes we don't have catch-up bulls, but anyway, breeding period would typically be very short and seasonal. Whereas the breeding period in the TMRs can roll over seemingly without end. Our calving to first AI would be 42 to 65 days. It depends on age of the cow, etc., etc. But it'll be a little bit higher for the higher producing animals with good reason. And so we work on a 3-week submission rate of 90% of the animals needs to be inseminated within that first 3 weeks of the breeding season. And so we're talking about reproduction here, and that is optimal reproduction. We need to get them into that sort of period. We have a lot lower production. If our average production, depending on where they are in lactation, probably averages around 20 to 23 liters. I mean, it's not nearly 40 of the TMR guys. And so it's a different situation. Those cows aren't being revved as much. Metabolic disease, though present, isn't as prevalent. And so, yeah, we need to consider these animals completely different. And we do have challenges that the TMRs don't have, but luckily vice versa also. Just to give you an idea, when we have a proper drought and the interlings are coming in and they're essentially becoming TMR cows, and our cows are just being fed properly and they're only getting 3 or 4 kilograms dry matter from pasture, luckily that doesn't happen every year. But in times when that happens, obviously the milk production goes up. The milk buyers have even told us it goes up to 30%, some farms. Metabolic disease just spikes, where we will sometimes do, I probably never do more than 7 or 8 displaced abomasums in a year. We would have typically then do 4 a day. And so just because of they're walking a very tight line in terms of metabolic disease, and the farmers and the system sort of worked it out very nicely where they can keep an animal with lower production on pasture with cheap production, versus the TMR, which really walks the tightrope on metabolic disease. And then obviously conception rate per AI is a little bit higher, and our cows live a lot longer. It would not be unusual to go to any of the dairy farms in now and find cows that's 12, 13 years old. We wouldn't even blink an eye if that happens. Obviously, that's not the average. That would be the exception. tail end of the distribution. But 5 to 7 lactations would be quite comfortable. Whereas I don't think the Alex Jenkinses of this world comfortably gets 3 lactations out of a TMR cow. So, and I think the main gist, you know this, but pasture costs R1 per kilogram dry matter versus, I'm not even sure what TMR cost at the moment, but I mean, but mealie is, what's that, 5,500 Rand a ton, is it not 4 Rand a kilo plus? So we produce food a lot cheaper. Rain falls from the sky for the most part, and they just produce it a lot cheaper. I don't know, at this stage, fertilizer and all that becomes a bit of an issue. So we'll see what the next year brings, but generally the concept holds. And so also, the next question is then what's optimal? You're all students and you all have a very good idea. The farmers probably used to be students at some degree, and you all know what an optimal exam grade is. We all can do better. I can run my practice better. I can do most anything that I do in life a little bit better, but it's not optimal because I need to play with my children and also run a practice and that kind of thing. And so the same with your exam grades. I mean, you do have to have a bit of a life also. So for some, a pass mark is optimal. For some they want an 80%. So it just depends a little bit on yourself. And so the same is absolutely true in terms of reproduction on a farm. And the reason I'm saying that is you need to consider that farm-specific situation. So no, I'm going to get to that specific situation in due time. But conceptually, when we consider what's optimal, you first consider what's optimal for the farm, because you can't treat an individual on a farm if you don't know what's optimal for that farm. And so you'll very quickly pick up on the nuances between different farms. But to give you some idea quickly, where I'm getting at with this is if you have a farm and it's like Prof. Lawrence perhaps had one of those, which is a family farm, and we do still have some which at least leans towards the concept of a family farm. It's run by the actual owners of the farm, and they typically have a more of a lifestyle farm. For them, it's not about squeezing every last single drop and getting every single cow pregnant within as little time as possible. Yeah, generally that'll be true for them. But for them, it's also important to watch the rugby when it's happening during milking time or cricket. And they'll have a flat screen TV on there. They'll have nicer coffee in the dairy, as opposed to the more economically minded guys, which might well not even have free coffee, or the workers must just bring their own. They'll have nice bathrooms and they'll have a shower. The other guys will just really have a little control room, which is functional, and the cow's been in there a couple of times and sat on the table, and so it's now on crates being held up, that kind of thing. So the reason for that farm's existence is just completely different, and what's optimal in terms of nutrition, reproduction specifically, will be different for these farms. Okay, so the life cycles. This is just general emotional intelligence, I guess, EQ. But consider these things when you do hop onto the farm, because you exit onderstepoort and you're so full of technical knowledge, and there's a lot of things you can do, but it's not necessarily optimal and appropriate on each farm. So this is perhaps more philosophical than anything. Allow me to carry on about that for a little while. But obviously, farms do differ. If you get some farms, if a guy buys a farm now, that farm generally needs to get into action straight away. The road walkways needs to be done. Everything just needs to get into order. First things needs to happen first, and on those farms, you typically do the basics right first. It's like playing rugby. You pass the ball backwards and catch the ball and that kind of thing first before you start to do funnier things, and this will be true on a farm that starts off or has just been handed over to someone else. And the same with the owner. If you've got an owner who owns 10 or 11 farms, his expectations of that farm's expectations and what's optimal on that farm will be a whole lot different from a guy that's an actual owner of the farm, like I've just explained. And so see where that farm is in terms of its life cycle. If it's an old woman and he's been milking there for a long time, his expectations are probably to hand over to his son soon. So he just keeps things going. He's not in this hyperdrive of doing everything 100% completely to the textbook. And so there's little sense in trying to push in that direction. It's not the role of the vet to go and convince him otherwise. And honestly, if you take a step back and you look at these people, I think the farm owners and the more family farm oriented people, they're not going to make as much money, and that doesn't mean that's wrong. I think they typically, and I'm going to use the word happy, because dogs, when you throw a ball, they're happy, but these people are probably more content. And yeah, so from a contentment point of view, they tend to carry on. And if the conversations on the farm isn't something like, yeah, I just need to get past this year, and then when I'm 60, I'm done, I'm finished with this stuff, and the guy just wants to go do something else. These actual managers have been worked to death. And whereas some of these other farmers, they're happy to continue till they're 70. I have one guy that's 79. He's still happy to continue. It's obviously in a reduced capacity, but much more sustainable. So it's very much, it depends on the owner, and what's going to be optimal in terms of any aspect of farming, reproduction in this case, will depend on the owner and where the owner is in his life cycle. Same with a manager. If you've got a young manager, it's new, it's a completely different story to a well-established manager that's been in the situation for a long time, and he's a good operator, smooth operator. His basics is completely in place, and for him, just doing a 5% improvement or a 3% improvement here and there is pretty much what he's going to focus on. And the role of the vet and what's going to be optimal in terms of nutrition is going to be completely different. You're not going to go and focus on heat detection and stuff there. The guy's got it down to a T. You're not going to focus on small little things. You need to go and focus more on individual aspects and perhaps see where stuff falls out, and perhaps more monitoring as opposed to reactive treatment and that kind of thing. So manager, same story. But the same old truth for season, herd. Farmers break up their herds in various ways, some with high somatic, some with low somatic, some with older, younger, some with heavier, some lighter, some that calve in spring, some that calve in autumn. So it depends on the herd as well. And I put Christmas in there just because I didn't want to say etc. The concept, I think, for Christmas would be consider what's optimal in terms of reproduction also, just because things like Christmas happen and you don't want to really calve during Christmas, for instance, or inseminate during Christmas, or institute a cedar program 10 days before all the seasonal holidays and stuff start. So these are all things that's typically life cycles. I've added a number of stuff that the farmer typically consider, and so perhaps I'm speaking more to the farmers here. So what's optimal in terms of your reproduction? Consider what rain. You always know what's going to happen with the rain. Farmers on YR, I don't know how many times a day. The fertilizer price depends on a lot of our farmers typically purchased a lot of fertilizer, and they might be starting to run out now. But consider all that before you start with your insemination program. Cow numbers, is the farm full? Is it the farm that's starting off and he's renting a bunch of cows and he needs to somehow replace them and fill with these animals? Then you can typically breed animals that normally wouldn't be suitable to breed, and just because you need numbers first, and then you can aim for quality of animals after that. So again, cow numbers is important. If you don't have the cow numbers, you probably need to fill up with decent cows before you can consider anything else. And so same with the milk price, meat price, and the macroeconomic situation. I'm not going to talk about macroeconomics too much now. So the role of the vet. So now that we have an idea what optimal means, the question is what is the role of the vet, and what does the farmer need to expect from the vet? For the farmers that's listening here, and so again, it's going to be almost impossible to do a case study because it's going to be so much different from farm to farm. So anyway, so we've got an idea what optimal is, and so let's get into a little bit more specifics. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time. You guys have everything in your notes. You know how a cedar program works. You'll read it up. You're not going to remember it anyway. Until you start to use it. You know the detail about heat detection and the ABs, A times B times C times D thing, and you know the details of how to inseminate and minerals and what. You can read all of that, and I'm not going to go through the technicals. I'm going to try and just bring all of that together. And so context changes stuff, and we've literally just now been focusing on context. So what is the context in terms of that farm and in terms of that herd, in terms of that cow and individual? So we're going to make mention of a few situations here. This, for me, is the context in which any sort of reproductive decision should be based, at least from an individual point of view, perhaps even heard. We all know this is lactation curve. Milk goes up, it peaks 90 days, 50 to 90 days, typically have a peak. Body weight will be dropping. And so if we can, actually know the old story, if you increase milk production here by 1 liter, we'll typically have a 200 liters increase over the whole of the lactation. In the pasture, I don't think they reach 200, but conceptually it's still true. So whatever you implement, if we can do it here, decrease the negative energy balance at this stage and increase the milk in terms of peak, then we just get more return throughout the whole of the lactation, as opposed to implementing the same strategy here. So, for instance, if we deworm an animal at this stage, yeah, she might not lose body condition as much and we'll get some milk for the remainder of the lactation. But if we can do it during this phase, while peaking and leading up to a peak, we'll just get so much more money back. And so, and this is also where we need to get her pregnant. Everything just focuses on everything is happening on this end, calving to peak lactation. And obviously, calving and the body condition leading to calving would be a dry period story. And so perhaps we can discuss that a little bit later. But the context of every reproduction decision is probably hidden somewhere in this story. I can't ask you questions now, so I'll just go straight ahead. Obviously, the sutures that the clients see after you've sterilized the dog and the PDs you do is pretty much all that the farmers see in a certain sense. And so we need to make sure that at least is correct. So when you as new vets just get the PDs under control, that gets you onto a farm. And so I'm talking here to the vets a little bit more. So the vet role would typically be the stuff that's straightforward. You will always do the PDs, and that will get you on a farm. Like I said, that needs to be done properly because it's really necessary. You can't do any form of proper optimized reproduction work if you don't have accurate PDs. And even that's not necessarily true. There are some farms which don't do PDs. They just go by heat detection, smaller little farms, and that works for them. You'll do the dystochias and you'll get to do postmortems, and that gives you an idea what's happening on that farm, plus in the region and in your whole sort of catchment area. And that allows you to sort of worm yourself in a little bit and allow them to see what sort of value the vet can add to the whole system. And so the day-to-day reproduction work, that'll always be there. You examine each cow and then decide to leave it or treat it and consider the economics and the partial budgeting and whatnot. But that will typically be the vet role, and you can't get away from those. But yeah, so these are all the regulars. The vet will typically deal with the dystochias and the retained fetal membranes and the endometritises and cysts and whatever. And the farmer will typically phone you up with these, or you will scan the animals and examine them or whatever, and you'll find with an estrus cows, and you need to make a plan with these. But I'm not going to go sit here and tell you that an estrus cows all need a seeder, because it depends on the context that we've sort of alluded to in the introduction. Okay, but these would typically be the regulars, and you'll do a lot of this. So consider that. But you'll have more than enough technical information on endometritis and estrus and retained fetal membranes and dystochias. Perhaps it's, Prof. Lawrence always used to have these parameters, and it's different a little bit for every area. But you need to know how many membranes, retained fetal membranes, is abnormal. And I mean, it's one thing to have a figure for a farm, but you'll soon realize that it's different for the first lactationers, and it's different from the 6 multiparous cows and so on. Same with endometritis, and it might differ. So just get an idea. If endometritis, you can almost measure to a certain extent by how much calcium they're buying from the shop or from the co-op. And like I say, there's a few things you can just bring together and try together, but those would be the typical things that the vets will need to be involved with. So the opportunities, I'm talking about vet here. What general workable info can you gain from the repro visit? So general level of management. As soon as you walk onto the farm now, there's the old story of if you drive onto the farm and the little tractor is, on a little incline, because the battery doesn't work, and then you know the level of management you expect to find on that farm. But and the same is very much true of just a general repro visit. If you go do a bunch of PDs, the PD dates are all wrong. The expected PD dates, they're not properly grouped, or you get a very good idea of the general management. You get a very good idea of nutritional status. I mean, the animals walk right past you. You can evaluate their feces. You can look at body condition. You don't even have to ask them about milk production. So these are all opportunities for the vet to add some value and really, I think, appropriate the use in terms of reproduction in this case. You can see if there's you ask them about or if you drive past the sick camp and there's 50 animals that's lame, that just shouldn't be the case unless there's good reason for it. And same with the somatic cell counts. That's sometimes written up on a board somewhere, or you just ask the farmer. Gives you an idea what's happening and what sort of pressures the farm managers are on and what's important for them also in that case. If you drive past the calves and there's heaps of dead calves, then you also know what's happening. So you get a lot of workable information just from a regular visit. And so that's, I think, where the difference comes in between a technician that, like Prof. Lawrence used to say, you go in and you do rectal tourism and you go home. The technician can come and do the post PDs, but you need to add value. And so if you're going to add value, you need to solve the farmer's actual problem, the ones that he wants solved. Small animal-wise, you will also see this. Clients will come in and the presenting complaint will be that the dog is, I don't know, itching. Meanwhile, there's a lipoma the size of a soccer ball sitting there. The presenting complaint is not this lipoma. You can inform the client that there's a lipoma and it can be removed, in the physical space occupying nature of said lipoma can cause issues, but presenting complaint is itchy. You can remove the lipoma miraculously, but still leave the dog with itchiness, and the client's going to be unhappy. And the same with the farmer here. So if the farmer has a perceived problem, at least listen to that and try to solve his whole problem. So by example, you do a post-mortem and the animal dies from red waters. His problem is what to do next. Does he need to go and block all these animals? Does he need to change his dipping program? He probably wonders, if it's a farm manager, he's wondering whether he's going to get a warning. You can't do much for that. But you need to sort of try and figure out what's this farmer's bigger problem and then try and solve that. That ultimately, if you really solve the farmer's problem, then it will lead to higher profits for your practices, more services, sales, and repeat visits. So the main thing is, again, solve the farmer's problems, because that's adding value, and that's the role of the vet in terms of optimal and applied nutrition, reproduction. So this is just a small little example. I think this stems from the days when I could actually ask the vet. But if a farmer presents 100 cows for an estrus, it's difficult to say whether or not it's too many. If there's only 200 cows on the farm, then yeah, it's way too many. If there's 2,000 cows on the farm, then certainly it's not much of a problem. And so you'll deal with that appropriately. You scan them, these 100 unestrus cows, and most of them have corpus luteums. So now what? Then it's quite clear and reasonable that they're probably missing heats or showing silent heats. And so the next step would typically be to focus on heat detection. So if most cows have no ovarian activity, but they're well and truly in an estrus, then now what? Obviously, you will approach that problem a whole lot different from the ones that's mostly just missing heats. These animals are truly not cycling. Look at there's an infinite number of stuff that can probably be the situation, but look at whether or not there's a subpopulation of animals. Are these all young animals? Are they older animals? Are they all the high-producing animals? Are they the TMR group that you don't know of? Because that also sometimes happens. Are these the animals that develop facial eczema during the dry period and subsequently they've had shot livers and they just can't pick up? So you're going to try and approach this a whole lot differently from the rest. Yeah. So and that's going to be completely different from a situation where cows are just returning to heat after AI. And that can also be so many things. And so it's also the role of the vet to answer a bunch of questions. These are typical questions that I literally get on every single day of my life when it's at least in season. It would be nice to ask you these questions, but yeah, so cedar cows on heat the day after the start of the program. Should I AI? Perhaps, I'm not sure if I can actually see responses here. Okay, let's keep it. So these are typical questions. I don't know how many of you would have an idea, but just think for yourself for a little moment. You do a cedar program and you insert the cedars today. Now it's going to be 10 days before these animals are inseminated, but the cows are in heat on day 2. Should you inseminate these animals? That's the question the farmer's going to ask you, because you've now injected them with stradiol benzoate or something, stradiol benzoate normally, and that will cause some of these animals to show signs of heat, and so clearly you don't want to inseminate them. And the farmers will typically ask you, well, this cow cycled in 40 days in milk, cycled at 16, now they want to start to breed this animal and she stopped cycling. Why does she stop? Probably lost body condition, but you can think of many reasons. She might have had red water, she became lame, she had mastitis. These are typical questions. So why does this cow come and heat every week? Why not 21 days? And so there's a number of reasons. It might be true, or it might be false, or it might be probably just cysts or whatever. Will a cow abort if she's inseminated while pregnant? Maybe or maybe not. You'll see. You'll do a lot of periods in animals that was inseminated a second time, and so, but they conceived with the first insemination, so not necessarily. And a typical thing that gets asked here is, what will my conception rate be if I use a cedar synchronization program? A lot of farmers want to, because they want to plan and budget, and I think the reality of the matter is we normally just tell them it depends on what the conception rate would have been with normal insemination, and perhaps for budget purposes decrease your expectations with about 5%. But I mean, some farms will have a 70% conception rate with 2 AIs, and others will be 40%, and so you can't give a blanket answer there. Role of the vet. So highlight the obvious. This is also sometimes just, it gets me. Really good farmers, and this is not to bash the farmers, this is just, it's human, and the same thing happens with me more often than I would like to care. But highlight the obvious. So farmers sort of, they're in that little world where they are, and everything's calming down, and they've been on that farm for weeks on end, and they perhaps see their neighbors over weekends, but they don't want to look at the cows because everything is just too much. And so they don't recognize the fact that their animals slide in body condition. And this really happens oftentimes. And so it's necessary to just have an outside person come in and just highlight for you. Most of these animals just aren't in a proper body condition. I mean, you understand a couple of them, but if most of them is going off track here, just highlight it to them. The farmers won't take offense. They actually really appreciate it. Never once have I had a guy, perhaps except when you talk about bulls, they really have something about bulls needing to look really nice. But anyway, consider the body condition score. Just highlight the obvious stuff. They're inseminating in the midst of summer, and it's really hot, and the cows are breathing with an open mouth like a cat in distress, and they're wondering why some of them just don't get pregnant. So just sometimes mention it to the farmer, so there's less pressure on the farm if they actually consider things like that. Heat detection issues, they sometimes pick it up, but you just mention it to them if it's obvious that there's heat detection issues. You know, sometimes they present a bunch of anestrus cows. Now, pasture cows actually show heat by signs of riding each other, and there will be these 5 Rand coin riding marks on a lot of cows. The TMRs, I don't think, get that a lot. So if you see that they're missing these things, show the farmer. They really sometimes do miss it, or they trust the guys that's supposed to be doing it, and they don't look at the obvious. And so, like I said, this is not to bash them. It's just the way things are. So as a vet, come from the outside and just mention some of the obvious. This is a busy slide. We're not going to look at too much detail. I think the bottom line is, you've heard a lot about the whole holistic story, but that really is the bottom line. So you know a lot about, well, you know enough about lameness. You know enough about what's happening in terms of climate and body condition and minerals status, and you know a lot of the indices that's necessary for good monitoring and management. Then we'll talk about culling a little bit, but you'll at least have some basic ideas of pasture management and udder health, and then the whole lot. And you need to consider all the new research that comes in, and technology that becomes available, and just consider all of this before you make decide with a reproduction plan of action with the farmer. Okay, so again, this is context and perspective on where we're sort of leading at. For us, that's very seasonal. We breed for a short period of time. The next two slides really is one of the main things that we focus on. This is specifically for heifers, age at calving. Forget the three groups. These are just larger herds. That's not the point of this slide. The point of the slide is you need to get most of your heifers calving 22 to 24 months. If there's a lot of animals calving later on, you're spending way too much time getting these animals, and this will be different for farms. You're spending way too much time rearing these heifers because you're feeding them for way too long. If they calve too early, I've forgotten the lady's name, was it Samantha or someone that mentioned something about overfeeding heifers? Yeah, then you've got issues with fat udders and udder edema as soon as they calve, and you struggle with them. And they need to calve, that's the other thing, is in a short period of time. If they don't have a proper close calving distribution, then you tend to have, well, they're not going to conceive within the next season. And so that's the other main issue. And that sort of leads us into this. Forget the bottom axis, don't worry about that. The bottom line is you need to get the majority of animals to calve within the first week to 3 weeks of your calving season, and then drop off nicely from there. Where's my arrow? Drop off nicely from there. This tail is a problem, and there's some things you can do to get rid of your tail, but you spend most of your money reproduction wise on this stupid tail that's just the pain of all farm. These animals calve last, and you've probably almost started with your new breeding season when these animals calve, and now they need to wait 60 days. It's just, they've got basically one insemination to get ready. And if they don't conceive, then really you should just get rid of them. But there are a few things that you can do to get your animals to calve higher up in the season. This distribution is ultimately what you aim for. You want a small tail and a nice peak right in the beginning. For these animals, some things that you can do, and I'm just going to mention this. This is not in my slides, unfortunately. The one option would be just to try and identify these animals, the ones that calve last in your season, because that's typically the ones that will, again, conceive late and calve last. You need to either try and synchronize them early, get them clean, first of all, get them calve in a good condition, move them towards the front. The other thing you can do is use, and this is actually quite comfortable and works quite nicely, is use short gestation bulls on these animals. You're not typically going to keep their calves anyway because they calve last, and you want to keep your calves that land first. And so use short gestation bulls. It makes a difference of about 2 weeks. And so next season they moved forward 2 weeks, and the next season they've moved forward after 2 years. You've gained a month if they've conceived both times. And that really works quite nicely. A month makes a massive big difference, and that's without doing too much on these animals anyway. And like I say, you're not going to keep the offspring usually. There's always the possibility of inducing these animals before the start of the calving season, not towards the end of the calving season. There's some ethical considerations around induction of cartridges. That's certainly not something we would like to see. But we have had 1 or 2 clients where they sort of used it as a management tool, did it 1 year, got rid of that tail, had them calve a month or so before the onset of the calving season. So they had enough time to sort of clean up. And they actually produced a lot of milk because they had a longer lactation. And at least a good 2/3 of those animals conceived within the appropriate season, and the rest we just eventually exited the herd for that reason. So those would be considerations. But like I say, I'm not an advocate of induction of parturition. It's just a management tool if you really don't have any other options. It's not legal in New Zealand, for instance. It's not illegal in South Africa, but we don't want to go and promote it. And the farmers don't like it either. Right? Those animals struggle to come clean, and it is a bit of a mess, but it can be done if you just need to get rid of your tail. The alternative would be to use heavily on synchronization treatments and rebreed these animals very quickly within season, but it remains difficult. Bottom line is most of your energy and effort reproduction-wise is going to be on these animals. Cows that calve within the first 3 weeks of lactation in a seasonally calving herd, you can't improve on them. It's almost little sense in moving them towards the first week of the calving season. I don't think you get your money back. People differ in opinions regarding that, but the main issue is the tail. Third round and on. Third round of AI and further on. Okay, so the bottom line is aim for the calving distribution first, and then we need to look at the individuals. And then we can make decisions for the individual cows based on where she is in the calving decision. Barrel theory, I don't know, you guys, how many of you have heard about the barrel theory? It's a very simplistic concept, and basically profit on the farm would be the water in the barrel. And if we're going to need to go fix stuff, there's little sense in fixing this little plunky or that one even. The bottom line is we need to fix that first. And so to a large extent, this gets overlooked. Now, having said that, I think universally, and most farmers will agree with me, and this is true even of my practice, the lowest little issue there is always management. There's always a way you can improve management. If you improve management, things are going to go better. It's usually not something the vet will bring to the table, and especially not something in a bottle or package with a package insert. So it's always going to be a management issue, and it's difficult for the vets can tell them where to improve. And I'm using my own practice as an example. There's a lot of things that we know we can do better, we know that we should be doing better, but again, what's optimal? And but from a management point of view on a farm, there's little sense in bringing a synchronization program to the table, fancy as it might be. You can really go quite cute with these things, or even automated heat detection aids or whatever. A lot of these things, if the management can't cope with it. So it depends, first of all, on the management, and that's always going to be relevant. So management always affects the staff turnover. If you've got bad management, they've got bad people relations, staff relations, there's a staff turnover, things just never get going on that farm. If there's a staff turnover, if it's a stable staff system, then things tend to happen quite comfortably, and you can improve a lot of aspects on that farming system. We do have some farms where there's a continual staff turnover. I'm telling you, I don't know what the role of the vet would be on those farms. You basically just go and do PDs in those cases, and don't waste too much time otherwise, and because you're just putting a burden on that farm which they won't be able to cope with. And the same with the ability of the manager. Sometimes they've got a new manager. It's a conscious decision of the farm not to spend too much time, money on his manager. He'll rather take a young guy, train him up. So don't go and give him stuff that he can't do. He needs to get the basics right first. Systems and procedures, again, that's the same on a general concept. And so, yeah, I think you've got the concept here. We need to look at management, what management can and do bring to the table before you implement an appropriate strategy. So on-farm restrictions, it doesn't matter which one applies to which. Like I said, management is always, these are just some of the major issues on dairy farms. You all know management is the main thing now. You all know udder health is always a restricted aspect on the farm. It's always true. Reproduction is always on there. Hooves are always going to be one of the major issues on a farm. Lameness and feed costs. I don't necessarily mean to put feed costs at the top. This is just random. The bottom line is these are major factors that always need to be considered before you can implement something appropriate. For instance, if the udder health is a major issue and all the milk is just leaking out of udder health, all the profit on the farms, I think a very basic reproductive strategy might be more appropriate, or even consider extending the breeding period. Go do something that's less efficient for a time being, just until you fix the major problem. And so focusing on udder health might be the most appropriate reproductive decision that you can make. Culling, I'm going to quickly just go through culling. I don't know to what extent I really discuss culling with you guys on almost the pertinent. This is the same for the farmer also, because whenever, let me just see which is my, I'm going to jump to this slide quickly. We're on pasture here. The TMR guys might have a better perspective on this. If there's 1,000 spaces, feeding spaces on a TMR system, that cow needs to perform. If she doesn't deserve a space, something else can go in. On the pasture systems, it's a little bit different because you always feel like you can just add a cow or two. So it's a little bit different, but we need to consider it in the same context. Does she deserve her space on the farm? And so don't worry about the detail of the slide. You all know what's a perfect cow. It should look like this and it shouldn't look like that. Bottom line is we need to stock up with the perfect cows. And so that's the purpose of culling. Now, you can't go and cull animals if the farm's trying to grow numbers. I've alluded to that in the beginning of this talk. So, yeah, stock up with the numbers first, but also still, even in those cases, slaughter the ones that needs to be slaughtered. So just a quick little thing here, the value of a cow. Because the value of a cow is not the slaughter value. If you've got a heifer, for argument's sake, is 15,000 Rand. If you buy a heifer now that's on the point of calving, and it's a little bit more than 15,000 as we stand, after 10 lactations, she's going to be only a carcass value, and that's 5,000 Rand. That means basically she's worth 10,000 Rand. So a heifer's production value, if you were to lose her now, you're losing a color now, you're going to get 5,000 for it, essentially losing 10,000 Rand worth of value. And so if you divide it, if you don't know the number of lactations of a cow, then just for the herd in general, any cow that you randomly pick out, some of them is going to be more than half the lactations, some will be less than half the lactations. And so if you just divide by 2, that means 5,000 Rand is the typical production value of any cow just randomly on the farm. So if something dies and you don't know which lactation she is, then you'll know. A cow that's 10th lactation, she's given a lot of production value. She really is only worth 5,000 Rand. So that's why I say divide by lactations. That gives you an idea what sort of, if you've got a value on that cow that you need to cull, in terms of reproduction, are you going to treat this animal, or are you going to make her a not for insemination and ultimately color? You can work out what sort of value you're losing. Obviously, you're losing more with heifers and you're losing less with older animals. So consider that. Space on the farm, we've mentioned that. Minerals, Alex has spoken about this. I unfortunately did not see that talk, but so I'm not, this is not too much. The bottom line is you don't need to know the details of the minerals. You've got your notes, you've got Alex's talk. This is just an example of that. Consider farm 27 here. This is 2017, 2018. This is just the proportion of animals that has inadequate selenium. So in 2018, a much higher proportion, more than 90% of the animal sample did not have adequate selenium, as opposed to in 2017. So something clearly went amiss from that year to that year. There's the same story for farm 29. The bottom line is it can differ significantly from year to year, and it's the role of the vet to pick up on that, do the analysis, keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening mineral-wise, and make a plan. You need to do that with the farmer. It's the role of the vet to sort of know what's happening in your region. This is our region, and I see the time's running out, so I'm going to speed up a little. The concepts are very simplistic. From the Gamtoes, these are just the various regions, and as you can see, the proportion of inadequate records for selenium in the Gamtoes is very low. So most animals would be fine in the Gamtoes, whereas in Oyster Bay, most animals that we've tested, more than 90% of them are inadequate. So it differs from region to region. So if you, obviously it's the role of the vet to consider that farm's supplementation strategy in terms of what you know also in your specific region. This is again our story. That there is just the outline of Port Elizabeth. This here is Jeffreys, that's the Gamtoes. St. Francis, Humansdorp is sitting there. This is Chikama, and as you can see, the proportion low manganese. There's a specific grouping here of animals where there's just not enough manganese, or enough manganese. Very low proportion of these animals have low manganese, whereas it's a different story here. So again, consider that. That's the role of the vet. Plot these things out for you, or just contemplate it at the very least when you consider supplementation for specific farm, because that affects reproduction, not specifically seeders. We're talking about just everything that you do know, the whole holistic story. Just consider all of these aspects. And the role of the vet to stay up with the research, the advancements in medicine, nutrition management, technology, etc. It changes from day to day. Subscribe to the Journal of Dairy Science, or become a friend of the library at Onderstepoort, and just keep up with what's happening. Visit Ruvasa congresses, etc. Male fertility, it's obviously the role of the vet to make sure that the bulls gets tested. Even this frozen semen quality, just make sure every single year there's a bump somewhere where a flask runs out of nitrogen. Just check these things from time to time. Other people can also do that, but it's the role of the vet to just at least remind them of doing these things. Check the nitrogen flasks in the tanks and so on. Okay, so you guys will be graduating soon, and I remember what it was like. You just don't feel like you can add much value to the whole situation. But that's not entirely true. The thing is, there's a lot of things that you really do know. You've been at least initiated on nutrition and supplementation of minerals, and with reproduction, with pregnancies, with dystocias, with various parameters and indices, with lameness and other disease, and with feed management, and with a lot of these aspects you've been initiated with. If you don't remember the details at that stage, just consider adding them all up together and read up that which you don't know. So the bottom line is, and this is, I think, roughly what Prof. Lawrence has actually mentioned, you don't have to actually know everything. You just have to consider that which you know, and you can find out that which you don't know. So there's 5 minutes left. I didn't actually intend on playing this little video, but we do have a bit of space and time. You've probably mostly all seen this little video. For those that hasn't, I think, humor me, let's play it. The bottom line here is, this is old. It comes from the 90s. As you can see, it's pre-2000. I was in my first year at Stellenbosch, still at that stage. So most of you have heard it. For those that don't, maybe you're young enough that you haven't heard it. There's gonna be a bunch of people that throw a ball around, and the white team and the black dressed team, they're gonna pass a ball to each other. You just need to count the amount of times that they pass the ball. The white team.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted.
Okay, so
it is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from Viscog Productions.
Okay, so the point, from a statistic point of view, 50% of people actually miss the gorilla. If you go and drill into the details, those that count correctly are actually twice as likely to notice the gorilla as opposed to those that miscount. So you can go and put yourself somewhere in there. So the 33% of those that miscount the 15 passes actually see the gorilla. 2/3 of those that count correctly do see the gorilla. And so that's not kind of the point. The point I'm trying to make here, and my screen doesn't want to carry on. We tend to see what we focus on.
This video is from research by Daniel.
We see what we focus on.
It is available.
We tend to see what we focus on. And going back to that first screen with the farmers, your focus is everywhere, and it should be, and we should salute you for it. The vets have a much more tunnel vision idea. We know a lot about smaller little things, and it's a bit like a golf or a tennis coach who, Roger Federer's coach doesn't play as well as he does, but he sees stuff that Roger doesn't. And it's the same here. So the role of the vet is just to consider, perhaps in terms of the wider aspects, that the vet will focus on, and just there will be a different focus on the whole situation as opposed to the farmers. And so you can work on your own limitations. Again, this is echoing what Prof. Lawrence had said. Try to see the gorilla, oftentimes on the farm. Things that are not the role of the vet would be implementation and perhaps even motivation. sometimes motivation is the role of the vet, actually. But implementing the heat detection strategy is not the role of the vet. So it's perhaps worth spending time on what you don't have to do on the farm. You can do whatever you want, but the farmer will need to be the one that implements it. And you might need to motivate him to do that appropriately. So when you go out, you can help those you can. The top clients will come. Just do what you can do. Be vulnerable but willing. And you can read up on programs, and you can, again, learn a lot from the farmers. So I think as you guys exit, you can add value to most dairy farms in South Africa.